I went to the movies a few years ago with my two best friends, Quinn and Rebecca. I'm a 21-year-old female, but at the time I was about 17 or 18. Rebecca was my age, but Quinn was 2 years older, and she was kind of like the protector of the group. She had a strong personality and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Another thing about Quinn is that she's fiercely loyal and would do anything to protect her friends and loved ones. We drove to the theater in my mom's car, laughing and cracking jokes on the way. It was always a lot of fun when the three of us would get together, and it was almost a shame that we would spend the next 2 hours in the theater, unable to talk. However, we were seeing the new Hunger Games film, and the three of us were huge fans of the books, so we were quite excited. This theater was part of a big shopping mall across the street from our old high school. It was a Saturday night, so the parking lot was quite crowded. As we were walking to the entrance, a car passed us. It was filled with 3 guys who looked to be a few years older. One of them gave me a long stare that gave me chills. I can't explain exactly what it was about them that creeped me out. It was one of those things where you would have had to be there to understand, but I will tell you that the 3 of us felt it. "Did you see that?" I said to my friends. "Yeah, that was weird. Don't worry about it though," said Quinn. Her confidence made me feel at ease, and we continued into the large building. We got our tickets and headed into the theater, choosing our seats in the center of the 4th or 5th row. The previews hadn't even started yet. The 3 of us were still laughing while Quinn told a funny story that happened earlier in the week. However, the laughter came to an end when a group of guys entered the room. They were the 3 boys that we saw in the parking lot. I turned my head back and watched as they took a seat directly behind us. I turned to look at Quinn. My facial expression said everything, like she could read my mind. "Don't worry, we can move if we need to," she assured me. "Let's move now," I suggested. They both nodded in agreement. We stood up and started walking away when I saw that same glare from one of the guys. I know this is all very subtle so far, but my intuition was nagging me that something was wrong. In a way, I would have preferred if they had done something more overt. That way I could have called security or even the police. But technically, they didn't really do anything wrong, not that I could explain anyway. We took our seats off to the side, a few more rows back. Although the view from these seats was not great, it was worth it to be away from those guys. I had almost forgotten about them while the movie was playing, and when it was over, the 3 of us got up and headed back to the car. I don't even remember seeing the guys again after that. The parking lot was dark by then. Small patches of asphalt were lit up by the sparsely placed lights. We made our way through the darkness until we got back to the car. I can't explain why, but for some reason I felt like I was being followed or watched. I didn't say anything to Quinn or Rebecca though. We left the parking lot and drove to my friend's home. I dropped Rebecca off first, then Quinn. Quinn lives in a fairly remote neighborhood. Her family has a large property in the country, so I was very alone on the dark roads near her place. Not long after I dropped her off, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. That was strange because there were not many cars on the road at this time. It was gaining on me. The way this person was driving seemed very aggressive, so I slowed to let it pass. As the mysterious car passed mine, I looked over, and to my horror, the car was filled with those creepy guys from the movie theater. One of them gave me that same glare that he gave me earlier in the night. Fear flowed through my body as I processed what had happened. They must have followed me all the way from the theater. They were there when I dropped off Quinn and Rebecca, meaning that they knew where they both lived. I called them both to let them know what happened. It's been some time since this incident, and I've not seen any sign of those guys. However, I often have the feeling that I'm being watched. Maybe it's all in my head, or maybe they're watching and waiting for the right moment to make a move. This story is about the time when I worked at my local movie theater. I grew up in a smaller town. It was fairly unusual to have a movie theater in a town like this. If you're from the city, then it's something that you take for granted. But where I come from, it was actually pretty unique. People would come from the neighboring towns in order to visit the movie theater. We never got new movies though. Everything was at least a few years old. The downtown area was a single street called Main Street. Original, I know. The theater was an old historic building that towered over the row of single-story units that surrounded it. I'm not sure exactly when it was built, but it definitely had some character. I often worked the late shift. The last show usually ended at around 11:30 p.m., but it would take me at least an hour to clean and close everything up. Therefore, I was usually there until past midnight. The red velvet seats and brass railings on the wall were a constant reminder of the age of this place. It wasn't one of those big city movie theaters. The floor creaked in certain spots. Doors and windows would slam due to air drafts. There were even some noises that I couldn't explain. I would often hear the sounds of footsteps or crashing sounds like someone had dropped a plate on the floor. Me and some of my coworkers used to joke that the place was haunted, but I didn't really believe it. The building was old, and I figured that was normal. One night, however, I changed my mind. The last show had ended, and I was the only one working. The last of the customers were making their way out of the building, meaning I was all alone. I started cleaning the theater, sweeping up popcorn and picking up garbage. I was tired from the long shift and eager to finish for the night. My eyes were focused on the floor, trying to get this place clean as fast as possible. That was when I heard a loud crash from above. Like I said, the building made some strange noises, even some that were suspicious, but this one was something else. It simply couldn't be explained by the wind or a creaky floor. Something had made that noise. There was no doubt. I took a long look around the theater, half expecting that someone was there, but there was nobody. The sound seemed to come from the old film room, which was above the theater where I was cleaning. We didn't use that room anymore because everything had gone digital. As far as I knew, it was just storage, but I'd never been up there to make sure. Although I was scared, I decided to check it out. I had to settle my curiosity. The old staircase seemed to last forever as I climbed it. Each step took me closer to the source of the noise. I finally reached the door to the room and slowly pushed it open. There were stacks of dirty cardboard boxes lining the walls. An old projector lay smashed in the middle of the floor. I sighed and laughed to myself, thinking that the projector must have fallen on its own somehow. That's when I saw something that terrified me. There was a pair of eyes staring at me from behind a stack of boxes. Someone was hiding in the room. This cold glare haunted me. His yellow eyes and furrowed brow tore a hole through my soul. I could hear his heavy breathing from behind the stack of boxes. I stood there for a while, what felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. For whatever reason, he didn't attack me. Maybe he didn't notice that I saw him. Whatever the reason, I slowly closed the door and backed out of the room. When I was out, I ran down the stairs and out to the street. I frantically dialed 911. The police arrived not more than 5 minutes later and did a full sweep of the building. I waited on the street while they were searching. My whole body was trembling while I thought of how much worse this incident could have been. After about 30 minutes, the sergeant approached me and told me that they didn't find anything. There was nobody there. They checked the entire building, including the old film room where I saw the man behind the boxes. He seemed to think that I had imagined it, but I know that's not true. There was someone there with me that night. I saw him with my own eyes. I continued to work at the theater for some time after this incident, but I never took the night shift again. I was too afraid that whoever had visited me might come back, and next time, I might not get away. It had been a few months since I'd gotten out of a pretty serious relationship, and I was using dating apps to meet some new people. This was the first time I'd tried using them, and I was 25 at the time, so I was a little late to the party. It's important to move on in times like these, so I saw it as a good thing. I matched with a girl on Tinder. Her name was Jody. She was a few years younger than me, 23, I think. She had a quirky look, like a nerdy librarian or something, just my type. We sent a few messages back and forth before I asked her to meet in real life. She accepted enthusiastically and suggested that we see a movie and maybe grab a drink afterwards. I don't usually like to go to the movies on a first date. It makes more sense to go somewhere where we can talk. But I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. There was a movie theater not far away from me, so we decided to see the new Captain America film the next night. It was one of those giant mega theaters that takes up a whole block. There was a big parking lot at the front that was not even close to full. I was a little early and I stood at the entrance waiting for a few minutes. We were catching the 7:30 show and it was only 7:15, so there was lots of time. I was a little nervous about meeting someone like this for the first time. I'd heard a ton of online dating horror stories, so I was worried that I would be the next victim. However, my concerns were quelled when Jody showed up and she looked exactly like her pictures. We talked for a few minutes before heading into the theater. The place was almost empty. Even though it was a weekday evening, I was expecting more people than this. Jody and I made our way to Theater C, which is where our show was playing. We had our choice of seats since it was almost empty. We sat right in the middle of the room and about a third of the way back. The previews had not started yet, so we continued our conversation. Things were going great so far. Jody and I were hitting it off splendidly. It was almost a shame that we would have to cut our conversation short. After a few minutes and the previews started, I felt the need to go to the washroom, so I said, "I'll be right back, I'm just going to the restroom." "No problem, I'll save your seat," she replied. I got up and walked to the bathroom, which was across the hall. When I entered, there were a few stalls and a single urinal. It was smaller than I would have expected for a theater of this size. There was one other person in there. It was a man just standing at the sink, looking in the mirror. He was around my age, but he had a disheveled look. I thought he might be homeless, but I wasn't sure. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot. I could feel his eyes following me through the mirror as I walked past. I didn't say anything to him, just went to the urinal and did my business. When I was finished, I walked to the sink to wash my hands, and the man was still there. The water turned on when I put my hands into the sink. It was one of those motion sensor things that are everywhere now. As soon as I touched the cold flowing liquid, the man spoke.
"She's not going to believe you."
"What?" I said, looking at him.
"She won't believe you. She'll think you're lying."
He repeated himself. "Haha, okay, whatever you say, buddy." I laughed. A sly smile appeared on his face, as if he knew something I didn't. I will have to admit that I was creeped out, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. This guy must have been messing with me, is what I thought. When I returned to my seat, Jody was there, an angry look on her face like she was holding back tears. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Like you don't know," she said angrily. I sat there confused for several seconds until I looked up at the large screen at the front of the theater. What I saw shocked and confused me. The finishing credits were rolling. Not believing my eyes, I looked at my phone to check the time. The time was 9:45 p.m. I had been gone for over 2 hours, but there was no way it took me more than 5 minutes to use the washroom. I may never be able to explain what happened in the washroom that night, or who that creepy guy was. It will come as no surprise that there was no second date, and the guy in the washroom was right. She definitely didn't believe me.